Hello, everyone. If I could just have your attention briefly. Hello and welcome to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm Jessie Mayer, the Donor Engagement Coordinator here at the museum, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to the 3rd Annual New York Jewish Book Festival. Thank you for joining us for Jewish Icons Judy Blume, Jean Carroll, and Marty Glickman, featuring authors Jeffrey Gurock, Grace Kessler Overbeke, and Rachelle Bergstein, moderated by Stephanie Butnick. We hope you'll explore some of the 17 panels that are happening throughout the museum today, meet some of the 56 speakers, attend one of our 3 writing workshops, and get books signed at some of our 16 author signings. We also hope that you'll join us for Gersuite, a concert by Marcin Masecki and Gare Mandolin Orchestra at 6 p.m. in Safra Hall on the 1st floor. While you're here, we also encourage you to visit our exhibitions and our Cafe Locks on the 2nd floor. The whole museum is open to you today. You can also pick up holiday gifts at the Pickman Museum Shop and purchase the books discussed today through McNally Jackson in our 1st floor lobby. This program is made possible in part by support from the Battery Park City Authority. Your donations also help us present programs like these. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Jeffrey Gurock is the Libby M. Clapperman Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University. He has written or edited 25 books, including Jews in Gotham, which in 2012 was honored as winner of the Everett Family Foundation Award, Jewish Book of the Year, and the Jewish Book of the Year by the Jewish Book Council. Grace Kessler Overbeke is assistant professor in the Department of Theater at Columbia College, Chicago, and Rachelle Bergstein is a lifestyle writer, author, and editor focused on style, pop culture, and families. She's the author of 3 books, Women from the Ankle Down, Brilliance and Fire, and The Genius of Judy. Stephanie Butnick, our host, is a prominent voice in the Jewish world. She's the co-author of Newish Jewish Encyclopedia, From Abraham to Zabars and Everything in Between, and travels to communities around the country to speak about contemporary Jewish life. Thank you again for joining us today, and I'm going to hand things over to our speakers.
Thanks, Jessie. Let's do Rachelle, Grace, Jeff. That'll be our lineup for the day. If you can't hear us, just yell. That's what we love. Welcome, and it's such a thrill to be here and to be part of the New York Jewish Book Festival, and to be like the first event of the day. We're proud of all of you for being here, for getting here on time. I imagine we'll have a bunch of others trickling in throughout. We will be nice to them. Welcome. We will not, we welcome everybody at any point during this conversation. I'm going to talk to these amazing authors for about 45 minutes, then we'll open up to you for questions, and then as was mentioned, you could go downstairs, buy their books, and then come back up for a signing right across the 2nd floor in the events hall. So, yes. Thank you all for being here. I feel like I can't really see you guys, but it's okay. If everyone else can see you guys, it's fine. We're here today to talk about 3 fantastic books about 3 important figures. These books are The Genius of Judy, How Judy Blume Rewrote Childhood for All of Us by Rachelle Bergstein, First Lady of Laughs, The Forgotten Story of Jean Carroll, America's first Jewish woman stand-up comedian. I'm showing you them so when you see them downstairs, you know which ones to buy. They're actually all grouped together, which is perfect. And Marty Glickman, The Life of an American Jewish Sports Legend by Jeffrey Gurock. Let's get started by the 3 of you telling us a little bit about your books, which either sort of cast someone we know or think we know in a new light, or look at them in a new way, or make a broader connection about their story, or shed light on someone whose legacy is very much overlooked. So Rachelle, let's get started with you. Tell us a little bit about The Genius of Judy.
Yeah, so Judy Blume is very much not overlooked, I think we can say. Especially right now, we're in this moment where everybody is starting to really reflect on her legacy. She's still very much alive, but what she has created in her body of work has been so impactful upon people who are now really have strong voices in the media and in filmmaking. So we're in, as the New York Times put it, the Judy Blume-assance.
I love this.
But one of the things that I set out to do when I started researching this book was I really wanted to understand what made Judy's work so sticky. There were a lot of people doing similar things to her at the time that she was writing. There were other writers like Norma Klein, like Betty Miles, who were writing great, interesting, adventurous books for children. But Judy is the one that sticks in all of our minds. when I told people I was working on this book, a lot of the times they would get this like dreamy, faraway look in their eye. I was speaking to one woman at a book party who's also a writer, and when I told her what I was writing on, she said, "Oh, you just get to make people happy." So yeah, I wanted to know what was so special about Judy that we're still talking about her work, 50 years later.
Amazing, and we will get into that. Grace?
Sure. I'm just reeling from my own Judy Blume memories. I think I told Rachelle before the panel, I was like, "Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret" is just affixed in my brain. But yeah, so the protagonist of my book is actually not very well known. I didn't know about her, and I come from a family of, I guess there's only way to, nerds. Deep comedy nerds. They named me after Gracie Allen. And I grew up listening to these old comedy records, but I'd never heard of Jean Carroll because really very few people had heard of Jean Carroll. And she was the first Jewish woman to do stand-up comedy, and she was a huge, household name, but she hasn't really been remembered in the same way that her colleagues have. And I think that aspect of kind of finding buried treasure was really exciting to me. I first heard of her in college when I was writing a history of Jewish women comedians, and I went to see this show at the Actors Synagogue, and it was called The Jewish American Princesses of Comedy. And it was a material by a lot of people that I had heard before, Toady Field and Joan Rivers, and and then this routine that I had never heard before, and I really wanted to know more, and spent the next 18 years doing so.
Jeff?
As you'll hear immediately, I'm a New York Jew, and I sound like a New York Jew, and I write about New York Jewish history. I was one of those kids who saw Marty Glickman as the voice of my youth. When I played in the playground, if I made a basket, I would say, "Swish," because Marty Glickman said swish. Long before Marv Albert said yes or Mike Breen said bang, I was emulating what Marty Glickman sounded like. One afternoon, I'm listening to a game, and the Giants are near the end of the game, and Marty Glickman says, "If you're within the sound of my voice, open your window and yell out, 'Go Giants, go, go Giants, go.'" So I go to the window, open the window. My father says, "What the heck are you doing?" I said, "Marty Glickman told me, go Giants, go, go Giants, go." I was also pleased that every once in a while he'd throw a Yiddish phrase into his narrative, like the Meshuggah just ran for a touchdown. Very important. One time he's doing a game against City College is playing against North Carolina State, and there's a fellow whose name is spelled Urine, and he says, urine goes left, urine goes right, urine is all over the place. But this book is not, so anyone who knew Marty Glickman, and my core audience is people, New Yorkers and others, men and women, and some women over the age of 50, who Marty Glickman was this icon. But ladies and gentlemen, this is not a sports book. It's a book about a second-generation American Jew who tries to make it in America and confronts all sorts of barriers to his ascendancy as the #1 announcer within the United States. In fact, in many of my works, I've used sports as a metaphor to understand American Jewish life, because I believe that how Jews eat, how they dress, how they play, how they recreate is an important way of understanding who they are within American society. And as time goes on today, I'll tell you more about how Marty Glickman fits into a particular moment in time within American Jewish history. And although he's a man and he's a sports figure, you'll see it applies to women as well, who try to break out of the ethnic cocoon of Jewish neighborhoods and make it in America, and all the barriers that they faced. So the book, all my work is, they say I'm a sports guy. I love sports, I played sports, I coach sports, but the book is not about sports. It's about the American Jewish experience through the metaphor of Marty Glickman.
You know, Jeff, the interesting thing is that Marty seems to always have a series of choices to make, right? Whether it's what high school to go to, the one, you know, what college to go to stay at City College or to go somewhere sort of far-flung like Syracuse. And sports was sort of his way out in many ways. But he, as you say, he does face a lot of these issues that Jews of that generation were facing, right? Like how much to assimilate later on in his career, whether to change his name. Could you tell us a little bit about this idea, this really fascinating idea that through Marty we can actually learn about the history of American Jews in a very particular moment, an important moment in American history?
Well, he starts his life in Brooklyn. He goes to James Madison High School, which is a Jewish school. 80-90% of the students are Jewish. He's living in an ethnic neighborhood where there are Irish, Italians, Germans, no African Americans. It's a segregated neighborhood. He's very comfortable in that cocoon. He ends up going to Syracuse University, not City College, for a quixotic reason, which is sort of interesting. As you probably know, during this time period, there were quotas against Jews going to particular schools in the United States. The rarefied schools, the Ivies for sure, but Syracuse as well. A group of fraternity brothers from the Sammies come to Brooklyn, and they try to convince, they do convince Marty to come up to Syracuse because they believe if a great Jewish athlete appears on the scene and brings glory to Syracuse, that will help other Jews get into Syracuse. Turns out he's an outstanding athlete, but it doesn't change things as far as Syracuse is concerned. So metaphor number one, we often talk about the significance of quotas and the problems Jews have. First state, he lives a charmed life. He goes up to Syracuse, he's honored there, he plays well there, and he does quite well. But it doesn't change things as well. Second metaphor, and I don't want to go on to this too much. Many of you may know that in 1936, he's scheduled to run in a signature event in the Berlin Games, Hitler's Games. A day before the race, he's taken off the team because the people who run the Olympic Committee, who've never been very favorable to Jews, don't want to embarrass Hitler by having a Jew win a gold medal in Berlin. There's a movie out there called Race, which chronicles the life of Jesse Owens. They get it all wrong because he's not allowed to run. In the movie, they show him and Sam Stoller, the other Jew who's sidelined, running out of the stands when the Americans win the race and embracing Jesse Owens and the other athletes. That is not the case. They stand alone, they sit alone, they are marginalized. I could say more about this, but 1936 is a very important moment in Jewish history. It's a prequel to the Holocaust. As Marty said, nobody died when I was sidelined, but it says something about where Jews are seen in the world. And one last thing. The ultimate enemy of Glickman in Berlin is a man named Avery Brundage. If I can use a Yiddish, a Hebrew term, Yamach Shemo, you should forget his name, because in 1936, he's the head of the American Olympic Committee. In 1972, 36 years later, he's still involved. He's now the president of the International Olympic Committee. And 11 Israeli athletes are murdered by Palestinian terrorists. And Avery Brundage says, let the games go on. So you can identify this fellow, his antipathy towards Jews going back to 1936 and 1972. Again, this is not about sports. It's about the position of Jews in America and in the world. And you know what? The story does not end with 1936, although I'll be quiet for a while.
Wow. So Grace, you know, Jean Carroll, who's born in 1911, sort of faces similar things, this idea of Jewishness, and for her also femininity, and stand-up comedy. So tell us a little bit about how she both breaks out of some of the barriers, and we will get to the Mrs. Maisel stuff, because she was one of sort of the inspirations for that character, but so give us a window into sort of like the real-life tensions that someone like that faces.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the ways that you're saying, you know, the Marty Glickman story is not about sports. And it makes me think of the fact that, you know, in some ways you could say the Jean Carroll story is not about stand-up comedy. It's about how Jewish women are seen. It's about, you know, she was coming up in a theater scene where if you were going to be a Jew on stage, there was a very particular way of doing that. And unfortunately, it was a way that was really inflected by blackface minstrelsy, which was, a predominant convention in American vaudeville. And the way that it sort of infected other kinds of ethnic representation was to make Jews on stage lean into this kind of exaggerated, lots of big dialect humor, lots of sort of cartoonish mannerisms. And so, I don't know if people are familiar with Fanny Brice. Perhaps you're familiar with Funny Girl. But, she's not someone who actually spoke with an accent, but this was the convention. If you were going to be a Jew on stage, you had to do the big, sort of goofy, what was this? And these, she called them grotesque Yiddish steps. And Jean Carroll was really not interested in doing that. She could have had a very successful career doing that, but she really wanted to break the mold of how people saw Jewish women, and she wanted to show that being a Jewish woman, the Yiddishkeit, the Jewishness, was not a punchline. This Jewishness could coexist with being savvy and sophisticated, and could you believe it, glamorous. And so instead of going on stage with these sort of goofy outfits, she would have these custom-made, gorgeous gowns. Her closet was just like a playground of, it said, custom made for Jean Carroll by Neiman Marcus. And she was very meticulous about being, she called it dignified, but I think the word that we would probably use is glamorous or sophisticated, and deeply sort of hyper feminine, as a way of saying, this too is a Jewish woman. And so I think, yes, it's definitely a story about like a woman making it in stand-up, but it's also a story about a woman who's trying to carve out space for the idea of, women can be funny and also beautiful and, traditionally feminine, whatever that means. And there's more than one way to be a funny Jewish lady.
I love this. By the way, can we look at this?
There's
look at
one
this?
other piece I
Yeah,
want to add.
please.
That Fanny Brice and that whole generation of Jewish women and men appeared in blackface on the stage, which reflected where Jews are seen in the mind of America, and the question of, you don't appear as a Jew, you appear as an African American, which is very problematic in many respects. So what you're telling us is that Grace is, fortunately for her, of the next generation.
A few generations down from Jean Carroll, if I do say so myself.
But also, I mean, look at this picture. Like, this is the most glamorous woman, and you're like, oh, wait, she's holding a microphone and she's doing stand-up. She's literally wearing gloves, those like evening gloves. That's amazing. And, I think that brings us to Judy Blume, who is, in funny ways, like now part of like the Jewish author thing, but wasn't really considered one at the time. But she's a child, an American Jewish child during the Holocaust, very much shaped by that moment in American history, and writes a lot of Jewish characters, but sort of manages to do something really, really interesting with her own Jewish identity and the casualness of both just Jews. Like, are you their God? Like, these are just people we know, we feel like we know so well, but at the time, she was doing many things, obviously, that broke the mold for what would we now call like young adult literature.
Yeah, I was just actually thinking about that as you were talking, Grace, that Judy's kind of on a continuum with Jean Carroll, because her Jewishness very much shaped her. She was raised middle class in Elizabeth, New Jersey, in a very Jewish neighborhood. She had a big family nearby with lots of generations. She sat Shiva for many, many different family members. So Judaism was a big part of her life. As you said, she grew up hearing about the Holocaust, seeing newsreels of Hitler. So it was very much part of her identity. But she didn't lean into that as a writer. What she did, which I think is actually equally important in a lot of ways, is she showed regular Jewish people doing regular American things. So in her books, which were groundbreaking in some ways just because they showed regular middle-class kids doing regular middle-class things, some of those children were Jewish. And some of those children, in the case of starring Sally J. Friedman as herself, which she published in 1977, Sally, the main character, is actually grappling with the stories that she's heard about Hitler and the Holocaust. But it's just part of a fully fleshed out person. You know, Jewish identity in her books is one aspect of these children's lives, and they're not all Jewish. So I think she did a lot for mainstreaming the idea that your friend, your neighbor, the people who live down the block, they can be Jewish, they might have different religious beliefs, but they're totally normal in every respect.
It's also interesting to think about how her life could have gone differently, right? She was in her 20s, she was a housewife in suburban New Jersey, she had 2 little kids, and she's sort of like, there's this itch that is again on a continuum of that moment in history.
Yeah, I like to say that Judy had a very regular 1950s childhood, which is to say repressed. She had a degree in education, but she was never expected to use it. If she became a teacher, that would have been considered a failure, right? She was supposed to find a husband in her early 20s who would take care of her, and she would have children, and she would have a beautiful home, and she would take them to their activities, and she would go to the country club, and she would play golf because her husband liked golf. And she did all of those things, and she was miserable, and she felt guilty about being miserable because she had this really pretty nice life, but she looked back on her childhood as a moment when her life was alight with possibility, right? You know, she could take dancing classes, and she could write stories, and she could act in school plays, and she could work on the school newspaper, and things felt truly exciting to her, and she felt that she lost touch with that creativity when she became a wife and a mother. And when her kids went back to school, she started experimenting with what she could do to regain that feeling of being creative, to regain that part of herself that she felt she had lost. You know, there's a quote from her saying at 25, she felt like her life was over. She felt like she had nothing to look forward to. So she didn't actually start writing immediately. This is one of my favorite facts about Judy's story. You know, I think now when we look at Judy Blume's work and career, we say, oh my God, you know, she must have been a born writer, like so many of us say that we were, you know, we've wanted to be writers since we were 4, and that wasn't the case for her. She tried various different things. She made felt pendants for a period that she sold in Bloomingdale's, so I'm like, if anyone has one of those, just please call me, because I'd really love to see it. But she stopped because she developed an allergy to the fabric glue that she was using. And I think about that all the time, the way fate just unspools. Like, if Judy hadn't developed an allergy to this fabric glue, like, maybe we wouldn't have gotten Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, right? But she started writing because it was another outlet for her, and it was easy to do while her kids were at school. All she needed was typewriter, you know, paper, some pencils, and she realized she had a knack for it. And it took work. You know, she wasn't amazing overnight, but she realized that it was something that really fueled her internally, and something that eventually people started responding to.
So, Grace, I'm going to come back to you because Rachel Brosnahan, the actress who plays the marvelous Mrs. Maisel, has said that she watched Jean Carroll video, like she watched her performances, sort of like her routine, and really got inspired that way for her character of Mrs. Maisel. And although, as you write, like one of the producers had never heard of her, so like in many ways she sort of isn't the sort of inspiration behind that role, or one of them. But there's something very, very different about these 2 characters. And you sort of talk to her as, you could call her sort of like the counterpoint to Mrs. Maisel, because she was very much conflicted about her public life on stage and her private life as a parent, as a mother in that moment in time.
Yes, and I'm just, the parallels are hitting really hard between Judy Blume and Jean Carroll and the marvelous Mrs. Maisel, because this question of how do you pursue your creativity and the thing that fuels you, while also, you know, being the mother, and not just mother, but, you know, the spouse and the sister and the caretaker that you must be, and especially, you know, in this mid-century moment. But I mean, let's be real, it's still a deep, deep, deep expectation. While just navigating that the push and pull, And so I think that the idea of, well, starting later in life, like deciding to pursue your creativity, is really interesting. And it wasn't the story for Jean Carroll, though, because Jean Carroll wasn't actually driven into becoming an entertainer by, you know, the desire to find her passion or like the thing that fueled her. That was the Mrs. Maisel story, and that was, it sounds, Judy Blume's story. But with Jean Carroll, it was all about necessity. I mean, she was in a really, really desperate situation. She was a child. She was between 8 and 11. She was she was an immigrant. She had a mother and 3 brothers and sisters who were struggling with an abusive father. And she was just trying to get out of a situation where she was watching her dad throw plates at her mom. And so, you know, there's not too many career paths that are available to children. But she started going to talent shows. And so she became an entertainer, not really because it was the thing that she necessarily loved, although I think that she did love it, but because that was the way to get independence. That was the way to, you know, save her mom.
Wow. So let's go back to Marty Glickman. Because in many ways, sports is this thing for him that, as we've heard, like gets him up to Syracuse, gets him to the Olympics, you know, that most rarefied world. But then we sort of do see him quite literally sidelined because he was Jewish. And I feel like he navigates something really interesting throughout his career because he's, as you say, like this beloved like New York voice, and he Jewish, proudly so, right? Yiddish, like it's so sort of in the sound of his voice. But in many ways, that sort of ultimately kind of keeps him in New York, right? It sort of maybe some ways prevents him from getting bigger. And so I would love it if, Jeff, you could speak to a little bit about like what happens to Marty after the Olympics and when it finally comes out, all of these feelings of this horrible experience that he had.
Well, he's a beloved New York broadcaster, but his great goal in life was to be a nationally recognized broadcaster, and he's sidelined again. But before he gets to that, he comes back from Berlin, and he goes to the New York Athletic Club, and he wants to work out. He's an Olympian, and he's turned away because he's a Jew. So he feels personally, again, that sort of restriction. And I have to add a personal note. My dad was a Jewish athlete. He wrestled for the 92nd Street Y. He changed his name because he didn't want his mother to know he was becoming a wrestler. And we had in our home a purloined towel from the New York Athletic Club, which my father stole when the Jewish Y wrestled against the New York AC. That was as far as Jews could get. We'll compete against them, but you can't be a member. Later on in his life, when Marty becomes famous, the New York Athletic Club turns to him and says, "Please accept an award," and refuses to do it, and he gets up and he tells the story again, which he hadn't told for 50, 60 years when they're about to honor him by the New York Athletic Club. But again, his great goal in life was to be a nationally recognized broadcaster. But he has a problem. He has the same problem that a woman the same age, Bess Myerson, has, who's the one and only woman who becomes wins the, help me.
Miss America contest?
Miss America. They want her to change her name, and she says, "I won't change my name because I'll walk the streets of the West Bronx and no one will know that I won this award." Marty Glickman is told to change his name to Marty Manning, etc. And he refuses to do it. And the saddest part and most indicative part is that he wants to be this national broadcaster for the new National Basketball Association, and he's turned away by the people who run the NBA. Their names are Maurice Podoloff and Haskell Cohen, 2 Jews who feel that we don't want Marty to be a national announcer because his voice will not work in Peoria. That tells us a lot about the levels of self-hatred or marginality that Jews faced at that time period. This is in the 1940s. Just as a trivia question, do you have any idea who Esau Danilowitz is or was? That's Kirk Douglas. He's one of the people who changes his name in order to make it in America. There's another name. It's Howard Cosell, Howard Cohen Cosell. People change their names. People are doing some important work on name changes. As you probably know, Jews didn't change their name, notwithstanding Godfather, the scene in Godfather. They didn't change their name at Ellis Island. They changed their name as they, again, go out of this ethnic cocoon to make it within America. You know, ultimately, the National Broadcasting Company, many years later, turns to Marty Glickman and says, we have all these former athletes who want to be announcers. Would you teach them? Would you tutor them? And Marty was so, taken by this that 40 years later, they're turning to him. And many of the great announcers today will say that they are disciples of Marty Glickman. And one methodological issue, if I may. How did I do this research, speaking and meeting with all these announcers and sports figures? I sent them an email. My name is Jeff Gurock. I have a contract for a book. I'm a professor of American Jewish history, and then in big letters, and I'm not looking for any money, okay? If you're interested in talking to me, get back to me. So many of them got back to me. They wanted to tell me the story of Marty Glickman. And the best story was my interview with Bill Walton. For those who don't know who Bill Walton was, he was a great basketball player for UCLA, Portland Trailblazers, and Boston Celtics. So I send him this email, and I get a call back from him immediately. We have to talk. I understand, why do you want to talk to me so quickly? He says, Marty Glickman was the most important person in my life.
Wow.
I said, what about John Wooden, your coach? He says, Wooden was okay, but Glickman was better because I used to stammer, as did Glickman as a youngster, and he taught me how to speak, and now I became an announcer. When Glickman died, the LA Times interviewed John Wooden and said, what do you think of Marty Glickman? And Wooden said, oh, he was okay, just okay. Yeah, he taught Walton how to speak, and now Walton never shuts up. Anyway, it was so much fun meeting these people. Some of them have asked me to do their biographies, which I'm not going to do, but getting through the door is always important and helpful. So Marty Glickman goes from being someone who's an outsider to being the consummate insider, the tutor to the great announcers today, including Gail Serens, the first woman to broadcast a National Football League football game. So Marty Glickman gets his revenge, if you will. But revenge isn't his metaphor. Revenge is not important to him. He wants to contribute. And later in his life, towards the end of his life, he becomes Professor Marty Glickman at Fordham University, and there's a Glickman Award at Fordham for the outstanding announcer who goes through the program.
Wow.
So that's Marty Glickman's ultimate triumph, if you will. Tribulations and then triumphs.
That's beautiful. And it also reminds me a little bit of Jean Carroll, who in many ways is both snubbed by the female comedians who come after her and then sort of more recently celebrated.
And also, I'm so struck by this idea of the Jewish voice that at first, Glickman was, they were like, well, no, we don't want to, he can't be a national broadcaster because he sounds too Jewish. Or like, Jeff, when you introduced yourself, you said, I'm a New York Jew and I sound like a New York Jew.
People love hearing my voice. I travel the country talking about Glickman, my other books, and people come up and they say, you remind me of the days I grew up in the Bronx. Now, I've got a friend who is a speech therapist, and I said to him, maybe we should work on my dialect. He says, are you crazy? That's your calling card. So, but things have changed. People work very hard not to sound Jewish or to look Jewish or to look different. That's the generation Marty was part of, and he had to deal with that sort of rejection that was pro forma within America. And by the way, he would have done quite well in Peoria. It's the Jews themselves who feel like Hollywood Jews who want their Jewish actors to change their name. They have a certain degree of self-hatred or marginality, which says to them, if we want to be successful, Marty has to change his name, which he wouldn't do.
And Natalie Herschlag is now Natalie Portman. This is still happening. But yeah, thinking about the voice, what is a Jewish voice? And Judy Blume, the ways that she, it's a literary voice, but it's still a voice. And for Jean Carroll, yeah, dialect, it was, she worked tirelessly to lose any trace of an accent. And if you, like, the reviews would often comment, like, she enunciates like an elocution teacher. And it's because this was the assimilatory move, right? Like trying to have a less Jewish voice. But I'm still just thinking about, like, what does that mean, a Jewish voice? And does it mean a New York accent? I mean, does it mean using Yiddishisms? Does it, I don't have the answer. I'm genuinely just like pondering this question of like, what constitutes a Jewish voice? Yeah.
So when it comes, could you tell us a little bit about that party to celebrate Jean Carroll? And
Sure.
all when she finally gets her due, the way sort of Marty does in the end.
Yeah, so, okay, this is a little bittersweet. In 2007, there was this biographer, Steven Silverman, and he wanted to make a documentary about the first Jewish woman to do stand-up comedy. It was called I Made It Standing Up. And it was, he was working with Jean Carroll herself, with her daughter, with, I mean, amazing roster of like producers and friends and colleagues. He had hours and hours of footage for this documentary. And as part of the documentary, the Friars Club had this night honoring Jean Carroll, where they had, Broadway performers and the mayor of New York, and it was a very spectacular night. Anne Mira and Rita Rudner and this star-studded sort of bench that were all commenting on how she inspired them and changed the game. And she took the mic. She was about 97 at the time, and she just killed. She gave this beautiful address where she says, I had no idea I was so good. And the crazy thing was, they taped this whole thing. It was going to be sort of the centerpiece of the documentary. But then the funding for the documentary got pulled. And so the documentary was never completed. So I opened the book by sort of setting the scene of this documentary so that even though the movie didn't actually get made, it's sort of like you can still be there, like you can still not see the movie, but sort of experience this this culmination of a 5-decade career, through what is hopefully fairly vivid description. But yeah, she was very, very shocked by the ways that in just trying to do her job, she paved an entirely new path in a new genre. I mean, now there's something called stand-up comedy. That was not part of the lexicon before her career.
It's amazing. And that brings us to the Blumeissance. This
Yes.
Judy Blume obsession, like young girls know about her now, that she's in movies. And it's funny because to me, I can't imagine a world without Judy Blume. Reading your book, I realized there was a world without Judy Blume, and she actually did something quite revolutionary at the time. And it was so revolutionary that we're sort of still impacted by it and still almost fighting about it in many ways.
Yeah, I think we're still processing it, and I'm not sure that we're done. But, Judy's major contribution was twofold, right? She talked about regular kids doing regular things. That now we look and we say, what's so special about it? But at the time that she started publishing her books, which was in the late 1960s, it was a really big deal. Books for children were expected either to have a really strong fantasy element or to teach a really specific moral. So when you think about E.B. White's books, like Charlotte's Web, we have talking animals, sure, but the books tell a really specific story about growing up. And it's one that, Beverly Cleary adhered to. The parents are always right? Kids are on a journey. We see Ramona acting crazy and making mistakes in school, but at the end of the day, her parents are always the ones who know what's best. And Judy Blume didn't completely agree with that. She really trusted her young readers to take away what they were supposed to from the books without having it spelled out, without having to say, and you should really listen to your father because he always knows. And it garnered her incredible trust from her readers back. She also really famously tackled topics that were unheard of in books for children, like sexuality, like puberty. I spoke to many librarians who said, before Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, you couldn't say the word menstruation in mixed company. It just wasn't a thing that people would talk about, and Judy really deserves all of the laurels for talking about those things in books and making it okay. I was listening to Grace. It's really interesting. Judy had kind of an unusual trajectory in that she had tremendous commercial success pretty early in her career. She wrote the Fudge books, if any of you are familiar, Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, and those books sold like crazy. So she had the admiration of her fans, who were children, and plenty of money from sales of her books, but the literary community consistently rejected her. If you read original reviews of Judy Blume's books, they are very condescending, actually. They'll describe her as weirdly popular with kids, or, one review actually described her as like a writer of pornographic texts for children. That's like something straight out of the media now, right?
Yeah.
So Judy, she's just now really getting people to appreciate her literary contribution, I think. Because she wrote in a very specific style for young people. It was very simple. It was disparaged as shopping list prose. But now I think we can look at her work and say, wow, what she was doing, it was deceptively simple. It was deceptively easy. She was speaking to children at their level, and she was doing something so incredibly tricky behind all of that. And I think it's now that we're realizing what she was doing and how important it was and how she's influenced an entire genre. The genre of YA now is so diverse and so interesting and so challenging and controversial in a lot of ways, and Judy started that.
That's amazing. So we're going to open it up to questions, and I'm going to come back to each of you and to give us like one enduring message, wisdom thing from each of these amazing people. Anyone in the audience? Questions for anyone, everyone? Yes.
From Brooklyn, right?
Brooklyn.
My husband also is from Brooklyn.
James Madison High School.
Okay.
My dad went to James Madison, too.
Only touched on the history of basketball announcers, or does he talk about other kinds of announcers, baseball, all other sports?
He did 2,000 games over the course of his career, including football, of course, from Yankee Stadium. He did horse racing. He did wrestling. You name it, he was out of the house almost every night broadcasting something or another. So this was his legacy. And again, people, the amount of people who can do imitations of Marty Glickman based upon their youth is very striking. We all have our moments in time where we thought we would be like Marty Glickman. And one of the young men from Brooklyn who really emulated Glickman was a fellow named Marv Albert, who became his #1 disciple. And it goes generational all the way back to that sort of thing. But all sorts of sports. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a graduate of James Madison, and as well as so many other important people. If I had an hour, I'll tell you about how difficult it was to get access to the records of James Madison High School, but I persevered, and we got that work done. Thank you for your question.
Anyone else? Yes.
It's interesting. Every one of you touched on simulation and that Jews tried to assimilate into America. And based on the way things are today, do you really think that works? Do we actually blend in, or are we always singled out anyway?
Ooh, that's a good question. That's a toughie. Who wants to take that one first? Who's feeling brave?
I think it goes in waves. Oh, sorry.
For assimilation to take place, to be complete, you need 3 elements to come into play. Motive, the desire to give it all up. Weapon, full Americanization. And opportunity. okay? Marty and his generation had the first two. The third is an accepting American society that let him be what he wants to be. Now, people will react and say, well, we're living through an era of anti-Semitism in America, and yet the big story for American Jews is you have all three elements into play. How do you maintain your ethnicity, your religion, your values? Marty was not a particularly observant Jew, but he wouldn't broadcast on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Footnote to Sandy Koufax and Hank Greenberg. Hank Greenberg, by the way, played handball with my mother in the Bronx, and she said he was a klutz, but be that as it may. So all those three pieces have to come into play, and in fact, they do come into play in a variety of ways. So I think we're living through a difficult time for American Jews, but if you ask me what the bigger problem is that we are assimilating and we have the possibilities of giving it all up. That's something Marty didn't want.
The thing is, though, that if you have all those three elements that you mentioned, the person who achieves that basically disappears as a Jew altogether.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
So then assimilation is not worth it if you want to stay a Jew.
Well, there is I sound like my class. There's a continuum of acculturation to assimilation that all of us find ourselves in. And the decisions we make have a lot to do with our values and the values that the host society imposes upon us or permits us to do. Come to my class tomorrow. We'll do more on that story.
Sounds interesting, actually.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great book on this topic, if you feel so inclined, called How Jews Became White Folks and What That Says About Race in America, which is by Karen Brodkin, a sociologist. And it's sort of part memoir, part book. And now I'm just plugging other people's books at this, but it's great. So, and what she says is just responding to that third factor, the opportunity to assimilate, as in, like, is popular opinion open to viewing Jews as the sort of highest echelon of upper class, white, mainstream Americans, whatever that means. And I do think that goes in waves. And so, you know, in the 1970s, for instance, that was a time when there was people sort of called it philo-Semitism, versus, you know, today that wave might be ebbing.
And this isn't only a Jewish story, by the way. One of the people I interviewed was Sal Marciano, Italian-American announcer, did baseball, did football, etc. I told him the story of Marty not changing his name. He said, it's pretty interesting. When I was starting out in Red Hook, Brooklyn, they wanted me to change it because it sounded too Italian, and I refused to do it. And many years later, he said, I met my boyhood hero, not Marty Glickman, but Frank Sinatra. And Sinatra said, you know what? I'm very proud of you because you made it in America without changing your name. That's the challenge to find a spot for yourself within American society without giving out the totality of your Jewishness. And that's Marty's story. Again, not a particularly observant Jew, but again, uses Yiddish, which we were very proud to hear. The Meshuggah ran for a touchdown, okay? That's something that we could relate to, and never give up your Jewishness.
Wait, so what was Judy Blume's real name?
Judith Sussman.
Judith Sussman. Jean's was Sadie Zeigman.
Oh, that's a good one, actually. But Blume was her married name, so Judy Blume was her real name.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Anyone else? Well, then I will ask you to just sort of leave us with a bit of wisdom, right, from all of these people, something that we can take in our own lives, something that really you keep with you as like their lasting legacy in this moment, for us, for you.
Yeah, I think about Judy all the time right now because she was such a champion against censorship in this country. And we're seeing now a huge wave to ban books from schools and libraries. And Judy was a victim of censorship. You know, there was a time in the 1980s when she was the country's most banned writer. Phyllis Schlafly of the Eagle Forum used to circulate pamphlets that were called How to Rid Your Schools of Judy Blume. And she was very despondent about it, but then she got involved and she became an anti-censorship activist. And I think that she's particularly relevant at this moment because we're seeing a wave of censorship again. And it's actually worse than it was in the 1980s. In the 1980s, it was led by grassroots movements, and now that's still true, but it's also being pioneered by politicians as well. So when you think about Judy Blume, think about her strength in the face of censorship, and think about how you can get involved too, even if you don't have children in the school system. I think one thing, Jews are not a monolith, but one thing Jewish people have in common is believing in the power of knowledge. So, standing up for books, standing up for children to have access to information, these are really important things that we can still do now and make a difference.
All right. Grace?
I think one of the things that is striking to me about Jean Carroll is the fact that there is the extraordinary embedded in what some would call ordinary. She was doing comedy that was not necessarily overtly political. She was not Lenny Bruce. She was not saying things that were shocking or scandalous or cutting edge. She was just talking about her life as a mother and a wife and a person, a woman trying to get everything done within a 24-hour period. And there is something quietly revolutionary in that, the way that she made herself a main character when she was really nobody's idea of a protagonist. And so I find a lot of solace in that there can be something extraordinary, there can be something worthwhile and resonant and even empowering in everyone's story, even if it seems ordinary. It's all in the telling, and so I think that is a useful takeaway. I also think that the idea, she was so certain. She said, I never was trying to be a feminist. I was never trying to go out there and wage some kind of battle of the sexes. I just knew I was funny, and so I did it. And so I think if there's a takeaway, it would be just do it. And also check out some of her comedy. Check out some of the comedy by other young women comedians or old women comedians. Just listen to women do comedy. It's very insightful. Jokes are so much more than just frivolous, escapism. I think jokes are sometimes where you get the most scathing, poignant social commentary. So seeing it through that lens, especially stand-up, can be a cool, eye-opening way of viewing it.
Amazing.
One last story. When Marty comes back from 1936 Berlin, the Brooklyn Eagle, that's the hometown newspaper, interviews his father and tells him, what's your reaction to what's happened to your son? And he says, I wanted to speak out. I wanted to protest. My wife told me, don't do it. It'll look bad for the Jews. It takes many, many years for Marty Glickman to speak out about anti-Semitism and what happened to him, although he's always clear to say this was not Kristallnacht, this was not the invasion of Poland. No one died. Late in his life, the U.S. Holocaust Museum grabs him and says, we want you to travel the country to tell young people about what happened. You're a metaphor not only for the experience of second-generation Jews in Brooklyn and beyond, but also understanding what happened to our people subsequent to 1936. So the message I portray is, yes, be proud of what you achieve, be comfortable in America, but understand that when anti-Semitism manifests itself, be like the older Marty Glickman, speak out and make your voice heard. His family would not do it, but he does it later in his life.
That is amazing. And thank you to all of you for this insightful, fascinating conversation about three more icons here on this stage. And let's give them a round of applause.